Well, good day, our friends. It's your old pal Jordan the Lion and the beautiful Katie.
Hello.
And we are coming to you from Austin, Illinois. And it's actually the childhood hometown of one of the greatest comedians in history, the great Bob Newhart, a man who made his humor with his stammering style of relaying telephone conversations. He never planned on being a comic, but he had a pretty interesting story on how he got there. So we're going to tell you that story today. Daze with Jordan the Lion and Katie. It begins right now. So these two buildings are relatively new within the last couple of years, but the old building that used to sit here was the very first home of George Robert Newhart, Bob Newhart. And he said that he lived like right on the border of Austin and Oak Park, so he would always tell people that he was from Oak Park, but it was only because that's where Ernest Hemingway lived, and he said a bunch of the Tarzan books were written there. He said he was always told that he was middle class, but then he said when he met his friends who were middle class, he realized they weren't middle class. He said his friends would all vacation in Florida and his family would vacation in Wisconsin. He said that his dad had a car that he would park behind their home when it was here, but he didn't have enough money for the gas to drive it. So Bob said that he and his siblings, he was one of four, he was the only boy. He said that pour sand in the gas tank, and then one day when their dad finally had enough money for gas, he went to start the car and couldn't start it. Was pretty angry. So he said they lived here for the first couple years of his life, but that his grandfather had purchased an apartment building with bonds from the war. And so we're gonna go over, and that's where Bob and his family lived. They moved from what was the house here on Maynard, and we're gonna go over to where he mainly grew up and lived until he was 29 years old. So where they moved to was just like 2 blocks away. So they ended up moving to the top floor of this building. Bob said that his grandfather had bought the building, but that because of economic times, people weren't paying their rent, and so he ended up having to sell his apartment, and he moved in with them, and they lived on the top floor. So he said that he lived in the dining room and grandfather lived with them, and then when grandfather died, one of his grandmothers moved in. So he basically always lived on that top floor, and he had all kinds of interesting jobs. Like he said, when he was basically where he got interested in performing was he went to his entire life were Catholic schools, and he said that because the school that he went to was an all-boys school, the boys would have to play women, and so he kind of thought that was funny and used to get a laugh out of people when he would do it. So he was always curious as to whether he was actually a funny person, or, you know, because of his stammer, if it was just, you know, he said funny things, or whether he said things funny. So he said he got a job at a bowling alley where he would set up the pins, and he would make about $6 a night, but he would end up spending about half of it bowling after he got off of work. Then he said he got a job as working in department stores, and he went to college and was originally going to be a lawyer and got like an apprenticeship at a law firm, but they were asking him to go in and make motions when he wasn't a lawyer yet. So he said he just felt uncomfortable doing it, and when it came time for him to take the test to advance, he said he just didn't even go take it. So he got into bookkeeping, and he was a bookkeeper for a while. And he said during the time that he was a bookkeeper slash accountant, that's when he would make calls to other manufacturing places, and he would play characters with like the other person on the other end of the phone. And there was one guy in particular, he said he did it with a lot, and so one of their friends heard what they were doing and said, hey, I'll pay for you guys to go in a studio and record some of this stuff. So he was trying to get into the business that way, where they went and made these recordings of like funny calls and were trying to sell them to radio stations, but they said half the stations, they sent them to like 100 stations, half the stations, you know, weren't interested. Like they got like 7 stations that were, but they said half of those ended up not paying them, and they were only charging them $7. So he said they ended up losing so much money that they quit doing that. But he had befriended a man named Dan Sorkin, who was like the voice of Chicago, and Dan Sorkin ended up recommending Bob to, there was like a local Emmy Awards, and it ended up recommending Bob to the director. Bob went and did the show and had a really good show, and then they ended up giving him a job for the local ABC affiliate, where every day he would play like a guy who was being interviewed on the street, but he would be a different guy every day. And he said he loved this job because he would be at the studio by 7:30, film his thing at 8:30, be done by 9:30, take a bus back to here, grab his golf clubs, and be on the golf course for the rest of the day at like noon. But he said that job only lasted 16 weeks, and he had been drafted in between all this. So he ended up serving 2 years in the Army, and it was his experiences there that gave him some of the ideas for his comedy bits. So he would end up doing these bits where it was like a one-ended telephone call, and he was doing a submarine commander. So he had written several of these bits and decided, he found out that Don Adams was coming to town, and he wanted to go and pitch the submarine commander to Don Adams, hoping that Don would do the bit. He said, I went through the whole thing, and he said, you know, it's not really something I'm into doing right now. And then he said, 2 weeks later, I'm watching the Steve Allen show, and there he does my entire routine of the submarine commander, like almost word for word. And that's when he changed his mind about being a performer. He said, you know, I realized if people were just gonna rip off my material, I might as well do it myself. So his friend Dan Sorkin said, you know what, why don't we record some of your bits? And I got a friend over at Warner Brothers. So they recorded a handful of Bob's one-sided telephone calls, and the guy at Warner Brothers loved it and said, you know what, let's record an album. And Bob had never even done stand-up before. So they ended up, he told him that. He's like, I've never done any stand-up. So they said, okay, well, we're gonna book you in Texas for 2 weeks, and then at the end of that, we'll record your album. So he said that's exactly what he did. He went and, you know, barely had enough for one side of an album in the time that he was there, but he was writing new bits while he was there for those 2 weeks. Said they recorded the album, and then he called to find out when the album was going to be out, and they said it's already out, and it was only doing well in Minnesota. But then all of a sudden he said it took off, and it was called Button Down Mind. And he said it did so well, it sold 1 million copies. They immediately asked him to do another one the same year, so he did Button Up Mind Strikes Back. And both of them ended up warranting him Grammy Awards. So his first year in comedy, recording after just 2 weeks, he became the best new artist, best album. I mean, he won everything, and that was mainly the start of everything. And he said, you know, during that time, he really saw himself as a loser. He really thought he screwed up his life, because he said he was living here at home till he was 29, and all of his friends had wives and marriages and everything, and he had none of that. He was just working part-time jobs trying to get something that would stick. And eventually it did stick. He became one of the biggest draws in comedy clubs across the country. Then he was a huge draw in Vegas. And then he had those really great television shows. So we're gonna go and take you over to where he recorded, well, at least what they use as the exterior for Bob Newhart show. And we'll tell you how that all came about. So here is the condo building that they used for the home of Bob Hartley and his wife in the Bob Newhart show. So how this all happened was Bob had kids, and his kids couldn't travel because they were in school, and he was kind of tired of doing the Vegas circuit. He wanted to be home with them. So his agent came to him and said that Mary Tyler Moore production company was interested in making a TV show with Bob. And so they actually pulled 2 of the writers off Mary Tyler Moore and had them start developing an idea for Bob's show. He said the first thing they came at him with was him playing a psychiatrist with a family, and he said, I like the idea, but psychiatry, you know, those are people with real problems, and I didn't want to make fun of that. So I changed the idea and said, why don't we make him a psychologist? That way he can treat people that, you know, may never get better. And that's kind of the way the show was. So when they were casting it, he said they were having a hard time finding someone that was a good match with him to play his wife. And one night, after doing several screen tests with people, his manager called and said, you know what, I know who your wife's gonna be. And he said, who? He said, I just was at a party with Suzanne Pleshette and she is perfect. So they met up. Suzanne also wanted to quit doing movies and kind of be stationed at home. So they ended up doing this show for 6 seasons. And what's interesting is that it was a hit show. People loved it. It was very successful. But at the end of the 5th season, Bob said, you know, I was kind of done. I wanted to leave on top, and I just didn't really think that we needed a 6th season. Once they had, you know, created the show, one of the things he had always said was, he said, I don't want to have like my character be this dad with kids that like he's the dumb dad and that the family always has to bail him out of trouble. So he said, if we ever come to that, like, I'm not interested. I don't want to do this show anymore. And it was kind of like in the 5th season, the writers came to him with a script where Emily gets pregnant. And he said, I read the script, and they said, what'd you think? And I said, it's a great script. I don't know who you're going to get to play Bob, though. Because he said, I made an agreement when I started doing the show that the only way we would have a family on the show is if Suzanne actually got pregnant in real life, which she never did. But he said, at the end of that 5th season, he just went to the heads of CBS and said, I really don't want to do a 6th season. And they said, we really want you to do a 6th season. And they tried to talk him into it. And then a couple days later, his manager called him and said, your lawyer needs to talk to you. I don't think you know what it means if you don't do the 6th season. He goes, well, what does it mean? They said, well, if they replace your show while you were under contract with another show and it doesn't do as well, they have the right to sue you for the difference between what they would have made from your show and what they made from what they put on. And he said, so how much money are we talking here? And they said, could be 20 or 30 million dollars. He said, well, 6th season it is. So when they ended up doing this show, he told a story in his book about how his wife one time, his real wife, Jenny, had woken up and held a grudge against him from something that he did in her dreams. And so when he did the Newhart show, which was a completely different show, and it was set in New England, up in Vermont and everything, when they were looking for a way to end it, his wife said, why don't you have it all be a dream, where all of a sudden Bob wakes up and he's laying in bed with Emily, and that the whole second show had been just a dream. And so that's how they did it. He said, we came up with a fake script so that nobody pretty much on the crew would know what was going on, so they couldn't spoil it. And we secretly got this set out and set it up, and then before a live studio audience filmed it and just begged all of the reviewers to not spoil what happens for 3 weeks because they got an advanced screener. And that's how they ended Newhart, by doing a flashback to the Bob Newhart show. Pretty cool story. Now Bob is immortalized. The Cubs fan that he is now immortalized with a statue right on the pier. So we're gonna go see that. So we made it out to the Navy Pier. Unfortunately, we lost Bob Newhart this year. But at the end of the pier, he was proud to mention in his book that there's a statue of him sitting on his famous couch, so you as a visitor can come sit with him. And he said, if you'd have told me when I was a young man that I'd have my own statue, I'd ask you to give me a hit of whatever you were smoking. But he did have a funny story about how a game erupted on colleges. It's called Hello Bob. and it was a drinking game, and every time you'd watch the show and somebody'd say, "Hello, Bob," they'd drink. And even when he was a guest on Saturday Night Live, Chris Elliott and Chris Farley did a spoof of that, where every time they were walking around the backstage area of Saturday Night Live, they'd try and find a way to run into Bob and go, "Hello, Bob," and they start drinking. This is my first time here. Katie, this is your first time here as well, isn't it?
It is my first time here. It looks beautiful.
Yeah, we came at the right time of the year for this. Hey, there's Rudolph. That is great. George Bob Newhart. Right here by the water. Dr. Hartley. Listening to your problems. That's an amazing likeness. That is truly an amazing likeness. They did you well, Bob. Lifelong Cubs fan, lifelong Pepsi fan. Died of natural causes. At the age of 94. His wife had died 2 years before. I'm not sure where they're buried, because online, where it says they're buried, I actually went there, spent about 20 minutes waiting for them to look everything up, and they came back and said, "We can't find any type of service, anything done here. No cremation, no funeral service, no burial. He's not here." So family has chose to keep it private. Best friend was Don Rickles. He said they used to travel together all the time, their families, and Don never learned how to work a camcorder. So he said all the footage was always Bob filming it. And finally one year Don's wife said, "You got to learn how to do it so Bob can be in some of the stuff as well." So he said Don hired somebody to teach him how to work it and everything. And the first time he used it, he filmed something, they started walking, he goes, you did turn it off, right, Don?" And he goes, "Turn what off?" He said, "So I had 30 minutes of a camera swinging at its side like this, of Don Rickles walking around Italy and walking around Paris." He said, "Every once in a while when I need a good laugh, I put that in and just watch Don's leg being filmed by the camera." So rest in peace, Bob Newhart. Chicago still loves you. And on that note, star of Elf and Bob Newhart show, Newhart, we're going to call it a day. Have a great night, and goodbye.